Living History Project, and we're going to be giving a presentation on oppression within the prison system. And this is, of course, all put together by Cy Rothleutner, Kaleigh Clarke, Zaire Brooks, Alana Gray, Van Harris, Matthew Erlec, Amari Sales, and Zoe Haralambidis. And also, if you haven't seen, we're going to be disabling the chat until the end of the presentation. So please save your questions for the end, just so we can go ahead and get through this, and then we'll give you guys some time.
Also, please be sure to mute as well. It helps us out. Thank you.
Also, before we go ahead and read you guys some of the overview, I just wanted to let you know that there is a trigger warning on this presentation. Obviously, we mean it to be educational, but sometimes being educational can lead us to sort of graphic information. So, you know, if you need to take a step to step away from your computer or your phone or anything, feel free and just come back when you're ready.
So why this topic? The first prison was the Eastern State Penitentiary, built by the Quakers, who thought solitary confinement was the best penance. Since then, prison has developed into a place that is less about paying your dues and more about locking people away that are just trying to survive.
2.3 million people are confined nationwide. 42,000 are in immigration detention centers, 44,000 are youth, and 22,000 are involuntarily committed.
Of the 631,000 people detained in local jails, 470,000 have not yet been convicted.
Of those 631,000 people in local jails, 115,000 are being held for other agencies, including 10,000 people being held for ICE.
Of the 631,000 people, 150, oh, sorry, wrong one. Of the 226,000 people held in federal jails, 78,000 are in for drugs. Of the 1,291,000 in state prisons, 191,000 are in for drugs.
$10,000 is the typical amount set for bail for felonies, which can amount to 8 months of income or more for many people.
1 in 6 trans Americans have been to prison. 1 in 2 Black trans Americans have been to prison.
In 44 states, a jail or prison holds more mentally ill individuals than the largest remaining state psychiatric hospital. In every county in the United States with both a county jail and a county psychiatric facility, more seriously mentally ill individuals are incarcerated than hospitalized, according to treatmentadvocacy.org. Now we're going to have our first presentation on unjust sentencing given by Kaleigh Clarke and Matthew Erlec. Let me just tell you a little bit about the two of them. Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, so Kaleigh is a 17-year-old senior at Oak Park and River Forest High School, and Matthew is a 15-year-old freshman at St. Ignatius.
Hi, again, I'm Kaleigh, and let's start off with some definitions. So, what is incarceration? Incarceration is the state of being confined in a prison. What's a prison? A building in which people are legally held as punishment for a crime they have committed or while awaiting trial. And what's a jail? A confinement for people accused of a convicted crime. Below is the process of the criminal process. First, you enter the system, you get interviews, investigations, arrests, and complaints. Next, you have prosecution and pretrial services, such as charges being filed, hearings, grand jury, and indictments. Next, we have arraignment, trial, guilty plea, and conviction. Second to last is sentencing, and last but not least, either probation or prison sentence. Additional terms to know that will be out throughout this presentation. Offense, an illegal act, and a felony, a serious act, for example, murder.
The United States currently has between 2.2 and 2.3 million people incarcerated in our nation, being around 700 people per 100,000 citizens. 52% of the people incarcerated are Black, with 1 in 9 Black men being incarcerated, 1 in 17 white men, 1 in 3 Black men, and 1 in 9 Black, 1 in 9 of all men, and 1 in 3 of all Black men, and 1 in 6 of all Latino men. You could take a look at the rest of these statistics, but there's a clear racial disparity in our incarceration rate of our nation. So how does the U.S. compare internationally? Well, like I said, the U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with this is a little bit outdated here, but with around 700 people incarcerated per every 100,000 people in the country. And what is the purpose of prison or purpose of incarceration? Well, the overall purpose is to enforce the economic system of a nation and provide a place to serve justice where due. And in the US, it is to do the same while also making a profit, which we'll talk about.
Now let's look at some prison conditions. 7,571 inmate deaths due to the Reuters investigation of prison statistics documented an unprecedented examination of morality in more than 500 U.S. jails from 2008 to 2019. At least 2/3 of the dead inmates identified by Reuters, 4,998 people, were never convicted of the charges on which they were being held. More than 2,000 took their own lives amid mental breakdowns, including some 1,500 awaiting trial or indictment. Nearly 300 died after languishing behind bars, unconvicted for a year or more. White inmates accounted for roughly half of the fatalities. African Americans accounted for at least 28%, more than twice their share of the U.S. population, a disparity on par with the high incarceration rate of Blacks. Reuters was not able to identify the race of 9% of inmates who died. Local policymakers can't learn if their jail death rates are higher than those in similar communities. Groups that advocate for inmate rights can't go by jail morality data to support court cases. Now, who runs the prisons? Over 3,000 plus jails are typically ran by county sheriffs or local police. They are often under-equipped, understaffed, starved for funds by local officials who see them as budgetary burdens. We will now move on to excessive punishments. These are some sentencing laws that maximize prison sentences. The first one is the three-strike law. This law was passed in 1994 in California. I will now play a video explaining the three-strike rule furthermore.
What about California's three strikes law? Tens of thousands of Californians have been caught in the net of the state's controversial three strikes law. Although it was sold to voters as a way to put dangerous criminals behind bars for life, 65% of those sentenced under the three strikes law committed non-violent offenses. California's three strikes law dictates that serious or violent felony convictions each count as a strike. The list of serious or violent offenses is lengthy. Felony manslaughter, rape, aggravated assault, robbery, and even burglary count as strike offenses. Individuals with 2 prior strike convictions can be sentenced to life in prison for a third felony conviction, even if the third felony is a non-violent offense. Any felony will do. Because of this, individuals, and some of them homeless, have been sentenced to life in prison for stealing food or toiletries. The third strike doesn't have to be a serious or violent offense. Remember, any felony will suffice. Under the three strikes law, your punishment for a non-violent felony conviction can be doubled merely because you have a single strike on your record. For example, someone with a prior felony burglary conviction, which is a strike, who's facing 3 years in prison for a drug charge, can be sentenced to 6 years in prison because of the prior strike offense. A Romero motion is one method your defense lawyer may use to try to protect you from the excessive punishment of a second or third strike conviction. A Romero motion is a request to the court to challenge one or more of your prior strike convictions so that you can avoid the harsh consequences of the three strikes law. In some cases, the court will strike a prior conviction from consideration in a second or third strike case if your defense attorney demonstrates just cause and that the interest of justice would be served. Of course, the most effective way to ensure that you can avoid the consequences of a third strike is to avoid getting convicted at all. At the Kavanoki law firm, our aggressive and experienced defense lawyers
I'm so sorry for the echo. I will just restate some points that were made in the video. The original purpose of the three-strike law was to keep the most dangerous offenders out of the streets. As mentioned in the video, a person who commits 3 violent or non-violent crimes will, after the third strike, will be locked up anywhere between 25 years to life in prison. The next sentencing law is the mandatory minimums. This was created in the 80s during the crack epidemic. Parole is limited and it is sentenced fair in court. Even minor offenses had sentences which therefore increased prison population. And next, I will expand on drug convictions in the next slide. Below are some drugs that are considered a felony. Here are some statistics on drug convictions. 1/3 drug offenders sent to prison were first-time offenders with no prior felony convictions. 1/4 incarcerated drug offenders was convicted of only possessing drugs instead of using them. Now we'll look at the racial standpoint. As talked about before, we are now going to talk about racial disparity. What is racial disparity? A great difference in race or ethnicity. Juvenile jails and prisons are held 48,043 youth of October 2015. 44% of these youth were African American, despite the fact that African Americans comprise only 16% of all youth in the US. African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons at a rate that is 5.1 times the imprisonment of whites. In 5 states, Iowa, Minnesota, New Jersey, Vermont, and Wisconsin, the disparity is more than 10 to 1. In 12 states, more than half of the prison population is Black. Alabama, Delaware, Georgia, Illinois, Louisiana, Maryland, Michigan, Mississippi, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, whose prisons population is 72% African American, tops the nation. In 11 states, at least 1 in 20 adult males, Black males, are in prison. And in Oklahoma, the state with the highest overall Black male incarceration rate, 1 in 15 males ages 18 and older are in prison. I will now play a video talking more about racial disparity. This video should not have echoes. Okay. Sorry.
The difference is they did not have the kinds of support structures, the second chances, the resources that would allow.
Going forward, I have empowered our prosecutors to charge and pursue the most serious offense, as I believe the law requires.
Overall, that video was just showing a few statistics about racial disparity throughout different races. Now let's look at some more statistics through images. If you can see on the far right-hand upper hand corner, the US prison and jail population from 1910 to 2008. Though this graph is outdated by a few years, it is a great representation of how the current spike in the prison population. Just because it stopped at 2008, the spike or the increase of the prison population has increased throughout the years. So that graph is continuing to go up. Though most of the US population is white, there are more Latinx and Blacks in the prison combined than the white population in the US. 10 to 15% of inmates awaiting trials won't come out alive due to what I previously stated, police brutality in the prisons. Out of the people under the minimum sentence, 38% of the convicted felons are Hispanic, 32% are Black, and 27% are white. Now let's look at convictions due to Black people. For murder, Black people are 7 times more likely to be convicted. For sexual assault, they are 3.5 times more likely to be convicted. And for drug crimes, 12 times more likely to be convicted. I will now read a story about both murder and manslaughter. These are both 2 same crimes, but both of them got different times. Ryan Frederick, a white man, convicted manslaughter in the shooting death of a police detective. He claimed self-defense against the unknown attackers. He was sentenced to 10 years in the prison. Gray, no last name given, a Black man, drunk, acting bizarre, pulled out 2 guns and started firing. Due to a mental breakdown, was taken in for treatment. At the trial, he was sentenced to life for murder and additional sentences due to his prior charges. Why is looking at the same crime important? First, let's look at the definition of manslaughter. It's a crime of killing a human being without malice afterthought, aka murder. And what is murder? A person who commits a murder, or someone who kills somebody. Blacks are 6 times higher to be convicted of murder than white. Though I try to search the highest rate of manslaughter, Black men are still the highest amount to be convicted. Even though white people are more televisionized for manslaughter, because Black men are more televisionized for murder, and that is more common on television, because murder is more blatant and harsh, this adds to the negative outlook of the Black race, the Black race.
All right, so first off, I just wanted to clarify the graph that I showed at the beginning is representing lifetime likelihood of incarceration. I was kind of tripping up there, so just wanted to clarify. All right, now I'm going to talk about life without parole. So 1 in 7 people in prison are serving a lifetime sentence, and life without parole is a pretty common sentence in our nation. And within that sentence, 33.5% of people are white, 56.4% are Black, and 7.4% are Hispanic. So Black people are nearly double as likely to be sentenced to life without parole. Now let's talk about private prisons. Private prisons are prisons that are privately owned by corporations and private entities. So they are able to make money off of holding inmates. And obviously, the longer they hold those inmates, the more money they get. So most private prisons prefer people with life sentences. Private prisons hold 8.4% of the entire prison population, and there is a stark racial difference or disparity, as Kaleigh said, in the public versus private prisons system. So you could see on this chart, might be a little hard to see, but basically a study was done at the University of California, Berkeley, with researcher Christopher Petrella, and he found that the percentage of inmates identifying as Black or Hispanic in public prisons and private prisons in 9 states there was a disparity of Black and Hispanic people in private prisons in comparison to public facilities. So it finds that there are higher rates of people of color in private facilities than public facilities, ranging from 3% in Arizona and Georgia to 13% in California and Oklahoma. So as Kaleigh said, Oklahoma is the state with the highest incarceration rate. And in that state, it is also within private prisons, Black people are the more likely to be in private prisons than in public prisons. So 13% more likely. In the Bureau of Justice of our country has stated itself that privately owned prisons actually increase recidivism rates by 20%. So this is people who are released from being incarcerated and then commit a crime again and go back to being incarcerated. So prisons making money off of inmates want inmates to return and stay longer. Well, I mean, that might not sound super surprising to a lot of you. And in fact, when a private prison opens in a state, the average sentence in that state increases by 23 days. And that's per each private prison that opens in that state. Inmates in private prisons are likely to serve as many as 2 to 3 more months behind bars than those assigned to public prisons. This disparity, the racial disparity that I talked about within private prisons and also within public prisons is furthermore developed with the use of public defenders. So convicted defendants represented by publicly financed counsel are much more likely to be sentenced and convicted than those who have hired a private attorney or lawyer. So about 7 in 10 people who have appointed counsel end up being sentenced to a prison or jail, and about 5 in 10 with a private attorney are sentenced to a prison or jail. So that's a huge difference of 70 to 50%. And according to the Bureau of Justice, 75% of state and federal prison inmates who had a public defender or assigned counsel, and 66% with their own counsel either pleaded guilty to the charges or they did not contest to them. And there's a racial disparity here as well. So while 69% of white inmates in state prison reported that they had lawyers appointed by the court, 77% of Blacks and 73% of Hispanics had publicly financed attorneys. This is directly from the Bureau of Justice. In federal prison, Black inmates were more likely than white and Hispanic inmates to have public counsel. So this is 65% of Blacks, 57% of whites, and of Hispanics having a public defender in federal court. How does this affect the community that people come from? So obviously, many people who are incarcerated are parents. So this leaves children without parents. And actually 1 in 28 kids in the US have a parent incarcerated, with 1.5 million fathers and 147,400 mothers as of 2007. That number has increased since then. 1 in 9 of kids with a parent incarcerated are Black. And it also takes away workers from communities. So when somebody is sentenced to a prison or jail term, they are obviously no longer working in their community. That's less tax dollars for many communities that are already disenfranchised. And then also, this will affect them obviously personally, and they won't be making income. And this includes when they're released from prison or jail. So 1/3 of unemployed 30-year-old men are either incarcerated now or they have been incarcerated and they just either can't find a job or don't have a job. And then there are also health disparities that come from this mass incarceration or a large amount of incarceration. So more chronic conditions picked up in federal prison, they affect people of color much more disproportionately, and people of color also experience higher mortality rates after release. During the age of coronavirus, inmates are infected at 5 times higher while incarcerated than the national infection rate overall. So there are obviously many effects on communities when mass incarceration is taking place.
So what can you do to help with these statistics and facts? You can also learn your rights, uphold prisons as responsible, and eliminate the sentencing disparity. Here's how you can do that. Eliminating the sentence disparity will reduce the number of Black men in federal prisons by 9% and save taxpayers at least $230 million per year. Thank you.
Next, we have Immigration by Zoe Haralambidis, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. Zoe is a 17-year-old high school senior attending Oak Park and River Forest High School. She's Chinese American and is passionate about intersectional activism, art, design, and education.
Hi everyone, yeah, I'm Zoe, and I think a lot of people have become increasingly aware about immigration, especially with Trump's policies of separating families and detaining children in cages. But this has been a problem that's been pertinent throughout US history and hasn't just surfaced in the most recent years. So I hope to teach you guys more about it. Immigration and prison are linked in several ways. And immigration practice as we know it now and what we think of as immigration detention now is a very recent development, and it can be traced back to the 1980s and 90s when the number of US prisons expanded significantly, specifically private prisons. And as Matthew and Kaleigh mentioned, the rise in private prison led for a lot of financial incentive to capture and incarcerate immigrants. Since 2003, more than 200 people have died in ICE custody, and the detention system now captures and holds as many as 500,000 immigrants each year. Okay, here are some March 2020 statistics. I know that numbers can seem like a lot, but I think they really prove the extent to which this is an issue. In just the fiscal year of 2020, ICE used more than $3 billion in taxpayer dollars to fund the detention of nearly 170,000 immigrants, detaining each person for an average of 3 months and in many cases longer. And this map shows the rise in detention centers throughout the 1990s and up to 2018. And as you can see, every decade or so, the number exponentially increases. So now I'll give you a brief history of immigration in the United States so you can have a better understanding of how the current conditions developed. Yes. So in 1970, the Naturalization Act granted U.S. citizenship to free white persons of good moral character. It excluded Native Americans, slaves, indentured servants, free blacks, and Asians. In 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, which allowed those deemed dangerous to the safety of the United States to be deported. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, prohibiting Chinese laborers from entering the country for a decade. It established the first class of immigrants to be excluded on race, a process of deportation, and the first immigration inspectors. The 1889 Che Chang-ping versus United States court case challenged the Chinese Exclusion Act, but the courts ruled that excluding immigrants from entering the country was an extension of sovereignty belonging to the U.S. government. This would be known as the plenary power doctrine, in which the power to control immigration is conceded to the executive and legislative branches. In 1891, the Immigration Act created the first immigration department, border policies, and excludable classes of immigrants. In 1892, Ellis Island opened, which was the first immigration station in New Jersey and in all of the United States, and actually the world. And then in 1910, Angel Island was opened, and that was the second immigration detention center. The 1929 Immigration Act targeted Mexicans and people who unlawfully entered the United States, which was a misdemeanor punishable by a $1,000 fine and up to a year in prison. In 1942, the Bracero program was created, which granted temporary agricultural visas to people from Mexico to fill World War II farm labor shortages. In 1952, the Immigration and Nationality Act caused a decline in systematic immigration. It established grounds for which a non-citizen can be blocked from entering the U.S. or deported, which include criminal history or radical political views. It allowed authorities to use discretion to grant non-citizens released from detention on bond-based community ties pending a final determination of removability. The mid-20th century, specifically in 1942, marked the end of the Chinese exclusion era, which contributed to the decline in systematic detention as well. In 1983, the world's first private prison was established by Company Corrections Corporations of America, or CCA. It entered its first federal agreement contract for immigration detention in Texas. Immigrants were first detained at a hotel owned by CCA while the Houston Contract Detention Facility was being built. In 1966, a set of laws known as the 1966 laws were formed, which included the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. They expanded the U.S. immigration detention system significantly by adding to the list of crimes of moral turpitude. These additions included nonviolent drug and other charges for which both illegal immigrants and undocumented non-U.S. citizens could be deported or detained. In 2003, the Department of Homeland Security was created. The former Immigration Naturalization Service, or INS, was dissolved and reformed into three branches: U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, Customs and Border Enforcement, CBP, and Immigration Customs Enforcement, ICE. The immigration detention system now falls under the purview of ICE. And for some more current developments in immigration history, in 2017, President Trump signs an executive order on immigration. It promises to fortify and expand U.S. immigration enforcement capacities in the detention system. And then in October of 2017, the Dignity Not Detention Act passes in California, which is the first law of its kind to restrict the growth of for-profit immigration detention contracting on a statewide level. This law was drafted and co-sponsored by Freedom for Immigrants. And here's a map of kind of how the U.S. compares internationally and what's happening with immigration internationally. Immigration detention has increased on a worldwide scale, but the United States still holds the largest detention regime in the world, with nearly 40,000 people detained every day. Now I'll go through the 3 types of DHS removals. An expedited removal is for non-citizens who encounter immigration authorities at or near a U.S. border with insufficient or fraudulent documents. A reinstatement of removal for non-citizens who unlawfully re-enter after a prior removal order. Administrative removal for non-citizens without lawful permanent resident LPR status, but with a prior criminal conviction which is considered an aggravated felony under U.S. immigration laws. All of these removals impose mandatory detention. And I will now go through the conditions within those detention centers that result as a punishment from the 3 types of DHS sentences. The number of people who have died in ICE custody in 2020 is more than double the prior year, even as the number of those jailed has decreased because of Trump-era policies that largely seal off the southern border to asylum seekers. Sexual assault, violent abuse, medical neglect, and unsanitary conditions are commonplace in ICE jails. An opaque web of intentionally corrupted contracts and inspections breed impunity for ICE and its contractors. Independent medical experts have repeatedly found that approximately half of all the deaths of ICE custody are attributable to medical negligence. Yet in the very same facilities where multiple deaths have occurred, egregious lapses in medical care and unconscionable delays in treatment persist. Later on, I will delve into the recent news event about the forced hysterectomies of women in immigration centers. The hileras or ice boxes, asylum seekers said, were overcrowded, unhygienic, and prone to outbreaks of vomiting, diarrhea, respiratory infections, and other communicable diseases. Many complained about the cruelty of guards, who said they would yell at children, taunt detainees with promises of food that never materialized, and kick people who did not wake up when they were expected to. If they talked too loudly, or if children were crying, the guards would threaten to turn the air temperature down further. When the Martinezes gathered with fellow detainees to sing hymns and lift their spirits a little, the guards would taunt them or ask aggressively, "Why did you bother coming here? Why didn't you stay in your own country?" Here's a visual depiction of detention conditions. They were unsanitary, crowded, and lacked food, water, and basic human needs. Here's the account of Johannes Favi, who was a father detained by ICE nearly a year while waiting his green card. He is a client of the National Immigrant Justice Center. In April 2020, he won a federal court case ordering his release from ICE custody due to the COVID-19 pandemic. He later spoke to the members of Congress about his experiences in detention. Here's the account of the conditions within the detention centers. Being in that jail for so long, it felt like torture. ICE has the power to free you, but they don't want to. It's on purpose, keeping you in jail to get to your mind, to your soul, so you want to give up on your freedom and hope in life. I saw many things in immigration detention I never thought I would see. Most of the people detained have no chance, and you see that every Friday when they deport 15 or more people at a time out of a cell block of 48. Many people are deported so fast that between transfers, they are unable to communicate with their families abroad or even see a judge before they leave. The rest of us who try to fight our cases felt that we were desperately waiting for our turn to be slaughtered. Some waited for a year or 2 years or 3 years, surviving on antidepressant pills. To us, detention sounds and feels more like prison. The number of people detained in my block who went from healthy to sick and had to take pills to sleep or for other health issues increased every day. I believe more than 60% of my block was on pills during the holiday season. Johannes Favi also gave an account of how immigration detention centers handled the COVID-19 pandemic. He stated, "When we first started hearing about COVID-19 virus from the news, the officers would say to me often when I asked to catch the news, 'You again with that story,' like it was a joke or fake news. But to me, it was not a joke because my life was in danger and my children are outside, depending on me. It is very stressful to be detained during this pandemic because you cannot take care of your own health and safety. At the beginning of the outbreak, the facility did not give us any instructions on how to prevent the spread of the virus. No one told us to wash our hands or avoid touching our faces. They did not distribute gloves, masks, or hand sanitizer. The guards did not maintain social distance. They would come close to us and speak to us. It is impossible to practice social distancing in detention. I was housed in an open dorm in a block that held 48 people. The dorm was split into 12 cubicles with dividers, and each cubicle had 4 people sharing one toilet and one sink. We had to line up closely together to receive meals and sit closely together at a table, just like at a restaurant or food court. ICE's reaction to the COVID situations demonstrate the inhumanity that plagues immigrant detention centers on a daily basis. Now I'll be discussing one of the most recent headlines in the news regarding immigration. In September of 2020, at least 57 women in a Georgia ICE detention center say that they were forced or pressured into having gynecological procedures. They were mostly Black and Latina immigrants, and they allege that Dr. Mahendra Amin, the primary gynecologist at the Irwin County Detention Center, ICDC, in Georgia, coerced them into having overly aggressive or medically unnecessary surgeries, in most cases without their consent. They forcibly removed their uteruses or fallopian tubes without proper explanation. This meant that these women would be permanently infertile. Black and brown immigrant women are held in extremely vulnerable position at this prison, where they have no control over their own bodies and no say about what is done to them, and it's sickening. That was the account of Azada Shahashani. The situation was an experimental concentration camp. It was like they were experimenting with our bodies. That was an account of an anonymous immigrant. Women have been denied proper treatment for cancer, brain tumors, and breast cysts within the prison system.
So now we will be presenting mental health care. Zoe's gonna drop some more knowledge. We also have Amari Sales. A little something about Amari. Amari is a 14-year-old freshman at Whitney M. Young Magnet High School. They enjoy writing, dancing, and learning more about the different societal issues that affect people globally.
Hello. So I will be presenting on mental health care with Zoe. So even outside of the prison system, people with mental illnesses are criminalized. Mental Health America states that people with serious and untreated mental health and substance use conditions often encounter barriers that prevent them from receiving the right services. Unfortunately, we do not have the appropriate systems in place to respond to mental health and substance use crises. Things like outdated treatment laws that demand that an individual must become violent before any interventions can take place, discriminatory Medicaid funding practices, and failure of states to properly fund their mental health care systems force people in need of care into the criminal justice and corrections systems instead of into the public health system. Don't call 911. On October 26th of this year, a man named Walter Wallace Jr. was shot and killed by police officers during a mental health crisis. Walter Wallace was armed with a knife, and the police officers were armed with guns. His mother told the cops that he was having a mental health crisis and pleaded with them over and over not to shoot him. They did not listen. In the initial call that was made, the dispatcher was informed that Walter Wallace was going through a mental health crisis, but there was an issue with communication between the dispatcher and the officers. That miscommunication did not matter, however, as his mother made it clear to the officers that he was going through a mental health crisis at the scene. Their family attorney, Shaka Johnson, said, When you come to a scene where somebody is in a mental health crisis and the only tool you have to deal with it is a gun, that's a problem. I'll tell you this as well. The police department should have a problem with that because they are setting up their officers for failure. If you ill-equip someone and ill-train someone, woe onto police officers. Police officers are not trained to deal with mental health crises, and it is endangering both them and the person in the midst of a crisis in danger. They are endangering both the person in the midst of a crisis and themselves when they respond to these kinds of calls. People with untreated severe mental illnesses are 16 times more likely to be killed during an encounter with the police than other civilians. And though they make up less than 1 in every 50 adults in the United States, they are involved in at least 25% and at most 50% of all fatal police shootings. Some solutions are sending mobile crisis response teams made up of mental health professionals, community health workers, and peers to respond to calls about people in the midst of mental health crises instead of sending officers who lack proper training, making mental health care accessible to everyone who needs it, and reforming civil commitment laws.
Hi, I will now be presenting on the criminalization of these people. Thanks Amari for presenting on the criminalization of these people. Now I will delve into the treatment of those mental illnesses within the prison system. So, inside the prison, about 1 in 3 inmates suffer from mental illness. About 200,000 of those suffer from schizophrenia, depression, or bipolar disorder or homeless. That's 1/3 of the total homeless population. Prisons have often been referred to as the new asylums because of this transfer of mental health care from state institutional hospitals to detention conditions. Okay. Here's a breakdown of some basic terminology. Any mental illness or an AMI is a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that can vary in intensity from mild to severe. A serious mental illness or an SMI is a mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder resulting in serious functional impairment, which substantially interferes with or limits 1 or more major life activities. The burden of mental illnesses is particularly concentrated among those who have SMIs. SMIs only affect about 5% of the population, which is still 9.3 million Americans. They are mostly classified under the diagnoses of psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and severe major depression. They can also include anxiety, eating, and personality disorders, though those are less common than the 3 listed above. Never mind. Yeah, this slide. So here's some statistics about inmates with SMIs. Individuals with SMIs are 3 times more likely to be in a jail or prison. 40% of individuals with SMI have spent time in jail, prison, or a correctional facility. And 68% of jailed inmates have symptoms of alcohol and substance abuse disorders. And you can see that the percentage of people with SMIs in prison is much higher than the percentage of society they constitute. Again, they only constitute about 5% of society. Clearly, this reflects a discrepancy in the prison and mental health care systems. And the reason why we distinguish between AMIs and SMIs is because they are legally and statistically differentiated. And as you can see by this data, people with SMIs are even more likely than those struggling with any mental illness to be incarcerated. So here are some breakdowns as of May 2020 of the most common mental illnesses and disorders of prisoners. The most common is substance abuse at 54%, Depression at 38%, chronic pain at 34%, chronic disease at 25%, heroin use at 21%, anxiety at 15%, PTSD at 10%, and psychosis at 8%. So now I'm going to be talking about deinstitutionalization, which was that movement from transferring patients struggling with mental illnesses away from state institutions, which were long-term inpatient care facilities, and back to their families or community-based homes. The causes of deinstitutionalization were the development of psychiatric medication that alleviated some of the symptoms that were being treated in institutional mental health hospitals, and the ideological shift from locking people away to being treated. And this ideological shift was largely influenced by Ken Casey's novel, which was later turned into a film, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the piece portrayed abuses within the institutional mental health hospitals on a dramatized fictional account of the author's own experiences. This turned public opinion away from mental health hospitals, electroshock therapy, and lobotomies, and they realized that people with mental illness were full human beings that deserved to be treated as much. People with mental illnesses or disorders were often seen as something to hide from society, and a lot of institutional facilities were a place to put them when their families couldn't give them adequate care. And another reason why deinstitutionalization became prominent was federal funding went to community mental health centers instead of institutional mental health hospitals. And these centers were largely outpatient and provided less intensive care. And I'm going to get into why deinstitutionalization seems like a theoretically good idea, but how it led to the mass homelessness and incarceration of the seriously mentally ill. So theoretically, deinstitutionalization sought to expand the rights of people with mental illness whilst cutting federal budget expenditures. However, this resulted in the discharge of hundreds of thousands of patients with mental illness. In 2012, there were only 14 psych beds available per 100,000 people. And those psych beds are referring to longer-term inpatient care. Only the rich could afford long-term inpatient mental health care, and private hospitals cost upward of $30,000 a month, which meant that many people with mental illness were homeless and incarcerated, and this was disproportionately affecting people of lower socioeconomic status, especially people of color. Yes. So now here's a more structured breakdown of the pros and cons of deinstitutionalization. The pros were it did challenge that lock them away ideology, which specifically expanded the rights of those with Down syndrome and other high functioning mental disorders. They were often treated as more human and capable of being a part of society instead of, again, being locked away, which obviously did not help their condition. The cons were that the short-term community centers were not an adequate treatment option for those with severe mental illness because they were outpatient, which meant that they weren't staying for extended periods of time. And I'll be going more into the history and the timeline of this process later on. There wasn't enough federal funding for these community centers, which made it really difficult to develop comprehensive programs or adequately address the needs of those with serious mental illness, because we live in a capitalist society and it seriously disservices everyone who doesn't have enough funding. And the courts made it virtually impossible to commit anyone against their will, even if it served the safety and welfare of themselves or others. This is debated a lot in ethics, and I think it could be seen as both a good or a bad thing that people couldn't be committed against their will, but I put it in the cons because it led to an increase in homelessness and incarceration. So I think the result is more what's troubling than the actual idea of expanding people's rights. So prisons have often been referred to as the new asylums because almost everyone in state institutional hospitals for mental illness were transferred to prisons. And they often give the economically underprivileged better mental health care than what they receive in the community. Their time in prison often was their first time getting treatment. Courts would liberally sentence time in prison, knowing that it would most effectively give the accused mental health care. Because healthcare is so privatized in this country, a lot of people with serious mental illnesses had to wait on lists for several months. And you can imagine if you weren't in an economically comfortable situation, how it would be virtually impossible to find care that worked for you. I'm going to be referencing a lot the account of staff in the Ohio State prison systems, and the documentary called The New Asylums went into the Ohio State prisons and explored the incarceration of those mentally ill inmates and their treatments. And the staff there acknowledged that the system was broken and this wasn't a long-term solution to providing mental health care. However, they also had to address the immediate need at hand because it was a public health crisis that was handed over to them. And even if they opposed the system that did this, they did have to deal with the problem they were given. So now I'm going to go into a breakdown of the timeline of this movement of deinstitutionalization. So in 1946, the National Mental Health Act was passed, which created the National Institute of Mental Health, or the NIMH, and this would also research ways to treat mental illness in the community. In 1955, the Mental Health Study Act established a Joint Commission on Mental Illness and Health to evaluate the nation's need for mental health care. In 1961, the Action for Mental Health findings were published, which recommended community health centers for those with any mental illness. Again, these centers were not equipped to treat people with serious mental illness. In 1963, the Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act was passed, and it funded these proposed community centers that were mental health facilities that tried to keep patients in the community and their families more. However, many of these patients didn't have families to go to, or families who were willing to continue to have a relationship with them. The goal was to build 1,500 to 2,500 centers, and as you'll see in the next slides, there were far less built than intended. So yeah, we can go on the next slide. Oh, wait. Yeah. In 1967, the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act was passed by President Reagan, and it limited the family's right to commit a relative with mental illness without right of due process. It reduced states' institutional expenses and increased treatment of mental illness in hospital emergency rooms, which obviously is not the right way to treat mental illness. They're chronic conditions that require lifelong effort to treat, and emergency rooms often treat people with mental illness as burdens, and all of their fixes were usually medication oriented and very short term. In 1977, only 650 community health centers were built, and if you remember from the previous slide, they intended to build 1,500 to 2,500. So there was a very small number actually built. The nation became overwhelmed with people struggling with serious mental illness because these community mental health centers weren't at the intensity of care that was required, and their needs couldn't be addressed by these centers. In 1980, Jimmy Carter signed the Mental Health Systems Act, which funded more of these community centers. It lessened federal focus on meeting needs for those with chronic or serious mental illness and focused more on specific at the moment needs, which again was the purpose of these community centers. And then in 1981, Reagan repealed the Mental Health Systems Act and passed the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And this shifted funding to the state through block grants, meaning that mental health care facilities had to compete with other public needs such as housing and food banks. These needs were prioritized over mental health care because policymakers and people who voted on where the money from block grants went didn't necessarily want to use their resources to support a group of people who are historically stigmatized in society, and they would rather spend it on helping women and children or veterans. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the impact of the prison system on mental illness. And the most prominent kind of thing going on in the prison system that hurts people's mental health is solitary confinement. There are two types of solitary confinement. One is disciplinary segregation, which is a punitive isolation used when an inmate violates a rule, and it lasts a short specified period of time. If you want to think about it in more simple terms, it's kind of like a timeout, and it's just used to punish inmates for smaller offenses. In administrative segregation, it's a long-term isolation that confines prisoners that are perceived to be a threat to the community indefinitely. And some prisoners were even kept in cages for group therapy. And segregation and solitary confinement deprives prisoners of any kind of social support, which obviously made it even harder for them to get better. So here are some ways in which people struggling with mental illness in the prison system act out. Some of these symptoms or acts include rape, physical violence and beating, self-harm, suicide, and hallucinations and delusions. According to the Treatment Advocacy Center report, a mentally ill man held in Montana tried to drown himself in the jail toilet. And in California, inmates tried to escape by smearing themselves with their own feces and flushing themselves down the toilet. A schizophrenic man in Georgia who was jailed after wandering into traffic and knocking on doors late at night gouged out his own eyes in his cell. Prisoners with mental illness are more likely than other prisoners to be held in solitary confinement, be financially exploited, physically and sexually assaulted, commit suicide, or be intentionally self-destructive. So again, referring back to the Ohio State Correctional Facility, which was the one interviewed for the new Asylums documentary, prisoners were transferred to a formal mental health hospital that focused on stabilizing mental illness and encouraging self-sufficiency rather than punitive work. And a lot of the prisoners reported that their conditions vastly improved, but whenever they seemed to turn the corner, they were put back into maximum security where their conditions deteriorated, and this became a cycle. So yeah, speaking of cycles, as Sai is going to mention in their presentation, recidivism is kind of known as the revolving door of the prison system and how people keep coming back over many years. And people with serious mental illnesses are often committed for misdemeanors and small crimes and then moved up to higher security levels. As their condition worsens, they act out more and they're punished for those behaviors. And when they're granted parole or released, they revert back to criminal behavior as their resources dwindle. A lot of them, again, don't have families or economic or social supports, and they could revert back to criminal behavior as a coping mechanism. Some of the ones from the Ohio State prison even recall that they intentionally committed small misdemeanors in order to go back to prison because they knew they could get better mental health care in those prisons. In the case of Robert Bankston, he was initially sentenced for purse snatching, but spent 16 years in and out of the Ohio State prison system because of the high rate of recidivism and that revolving door. So here's a graphic breakdown of that cycle. People with mental illness first don't have adequate resources and support systems, and then they're criminalized or use criminal behavior as a coping mechanism or means of survival. Then they are imprisoned. Then the conditions within the prison system continue to worsen their mental illness, and one of these was solitary confinement. And if and when they receive adequate treatment, they are released back into the same broken society without proper resources. There have been a few possible solutions proposed, one of them being mental health courts, which are an alternative to incarceration, which mandate therapy time instead of time in a jail. And they require that they continue judicial supervision. They require, well, it's voluntary mental health treatment, but it's strongly encouraged. And they continue the supervision after the treatment plan to make sure that people are compliant with it. The U.S. Department of Justice puts forward these steps to help prisoners return back into society. Help ex-prisoners find and keep employment, identify transitional housing, and provide mentoring. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Next, we will have the Poverty to Prison Pipeline presented by Cy. Cy Rothleutner, or Cy, is a 17-year-old high school senior at Dutchtown High School in Geismar, Louisiana. They are non-binary and use both she, her, and they, them pronouns. They enjoy discussing and researching social issues and educating themselves about unknown topics. Also, shout out to Zaire Brooks. He is a 19-year-old sophomore at Triton University, and he helped put together the presentation as well. So enjoy Cy's presentation.
Hi. Next slide. The poverty to prison pipeline refers to the monetary advantage the directors of privately owned prisons experience in the system, which comprehensively disables poor people who are statistically more at risk of entering the prison system than those in the upper class. I'll be specifically talking about how the cash bail system and recidivism contributes to the poverty to prison pipeline, but the prison system in general targets impoverished people. A quote from the Center for Community Change states, 2/3 of people detained in jails report annual incomes under $12,000 prior to arrest. Not to mention all the people who were incarcerated as juveniles and grew up in and out of the prison system who didn't have an opportunity to make money outside of the small wages from prison labor. The system not only creates inmates, but also keeps them in the prison monetarily because, as was previously mentioned, the prisons get a stipend for each inmate. So keeping people in the prison system makes those who run private prisons even richer and more inclined to find ways to charge people in the prison, making them poorer. The cash bail system. Bail refers to the restrictions that are placed on a person accused of a crime before they go to trial to make sure they comply with the legal process. In the cash bail system, a person is required to pay a bail bond to allow them freedom until their trial. A bail bond, or the money used to pay the bail, is used as collateral to make sure that the person will show up to court. This is problematic because if someone doesn't have the money to pay the bail bond, they are put in jail for a crime they haven't been convicted of. According to the Center for American Progress, 3 out of 5 people in U.S. jails today have not been convicted of a crime. Also, being in jail because of bail can cause people to lose their jobs and housing, which prevents them from being able to afford legal fees and may put them in debt or poverty. Recidivism. Recidivism, as previously mentioned by Zoe, is the tendency of a person to recommit a criminal behavior. Because the prison system fails to serve the purpose of rehabilitating people to become model citizens, most former inmates end up way worse than when they enter the prison. What does this have to do with the poverty to prison pipeline? Because of the revolving door, where inmates are released, enter poverty, then go back into prison and repeat the cycle all over again. According to the National Institute of Justice, almost 44% of the recently released return before the end of their first year. There are many factors that can make a person reoffend once they're out of prison. Most of most of them leading to the person becoming impoverished before returning. This is shown in another quote from the Center for Community Change. Incarceration contributes to poverty by creating employment barriers, reducing earnings and decreasing economic security through criminal debt, fees, and fines, making access to public benefits difficult or impossible, and disrupting communities where formerly incarcerated people reside. So here are some factors that may cause people to reoffend due to poverty. One factor that may cause a person to recommit a crime or go back to prison is homelessness. More than 10% of those coming in and out of prisons and jails are homeless in the months preceding and following their incarceration. This is because many may not have a family or person to come back to, or that can support them until they can work or financially take care of themselves. If something happens where they lose the housing they have and they can't find any due to poverty, they can go right back to prison. If a person has nowhere to go when they're released, they may end up in a halfway house. There are many different types of halfway houses for many different types of rehabilitation, but the general definition for a halfway house is a residential facility where people leaving prison or jail are required to live before being fully released into their communities. This may sound like an ideal solution to stop people from being homeless, but they can cause other problems. Some halfway houses require their residents to get a job to show their rehabilitation, but it's hard for the average citizen to get a job, let alone a person who just got out of prison. Halfway houses may also be in impoverished communities, so it could make it even harder to find a job and can give them opportunities to reoffend. The recidivism rate for community education centers, the company that runs 30% of all halfway houses nationwide, is as high as 67%. Similar to halfway houses, parole is meant to rehabilitate former prisoners and keep them from reoffending, but also like halfway houses, they don't actually serve their purpose. As the McKennick Center for Public Policy states, parole is only a conditional release from prison that a felon is granted in exchange for following a number of rules. There are many strict rules, including frequently checking in with your PO or parole officer, having stable housing, a curfew, etc. Not to mention the specific restrictions a person may have depending on the charge they were convicted on. Like some people may not be able to drive cars, have money, or a bank account, etc. Most of these things prevent newly released people from keeping a job, moreover, sending them back into poverty and back into the prison system. If you're just getting out of prison and you can't drive a car and you can't get a job because your curfew's at 7 and most businesses close at 9 or 10, how are you going to earn money to live? Or if you break one of the many strict parole rules because you were trying to make money to survive, you go right back to jail. So for many, it's poverty or prison, which means poverty then prison. Lack of social services. Another factor that makes it difficult for people recently released from prison is the lack of social programs available to assist them. A quote from the American Psychological Association states, "A majority of states ban individuals with drug felony convictions from being eligible for federally funded public assistance and food stamps." And a quote from the Center for Community Change states, "People with certain types of criminal records encounter roadblocks, and in some cases are completely barred from receiving cash assistance, food stamps, and housing assistance, which effectively reduce poverty and support working families. The reason why they need so much public assistance when they get out is because they may not have a home to go to, money to live on, food to eat, an education to pursue, etc. So by preventing them from getting those things, the prison system pushes them back into poverty and in turn right back through the revolving doors into prison." Employment. This was mentioned in other sections, but it is very hard for a person who just got out of prison to get a job. The Prison Policy Initiative shows that formerly incarcerated people are unemployed at a rate of over 27%, which is nearly 5 times higher than the unemployment rate for the general U.S. population, and substantially higher than even the worst years of the Great Depression, which was 25%. A year after release, 60% of formerly incarcerated people remain unemployed. They aren't likely to get a job for a number of reasons, most of them stemming from the stigma of coming out of prison. Most businesses do background checks and are looking for convictions or other offenses. 65 million Americans, or 1 in 4 adults, have a criminal record that may show up in a routine background check. Also, people coming out of prison may not have the necessary job skills required in the outside world, depending on how long they were in it. Since they are not likely to get a job, many may lose housing, go hungry, or resort to illegal activities to survive. However, this can land them right back in jail. Okay. Oops. Okay. This is my presentation on trans and non-binary people. Prison in general is an oppressive force towards all people, but it's especially oppressive towards trans and non-binary people when it comes to housing, healthcare, physical and sexual abuse, and general mistreatment because of their gender identity. So huge disclaimer, I will be talking about gender and sex in depth, and my information may not be correct or use some outdated terms, so please let me know in the questions if it was insensitive or outdated. Here are some terms to know and that I'll use in my presentation. Gender or gender identity. Identity. A person's perception, understanding, and experience of themselves and roles in society. It's their inner sense about who they're meant to be and how they want to interact with the world. Cisgender or cis. Someone whose gender identity aligns with their biological sex. Cishet, referring to a cis straight person. Transgender, someone whose gender identity is different from the gender they were thought to be at birth. Non-binary, a term people use to describe genders that don't fall entirely into male or female categories. They may be agender, genderqueer, gender fluid, etc. Gender dysphoria, a conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender and the gender in which they identify. People with gender dysphoria can be very uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned, like their body or the expected roles of their assigned gender. Sex is usually determined at birth or prenatally using biological markers such as chromosomes and the presence of sex organs. AMAB, assigned male at birth. AFAB, assigned female at birth. Intersex. Intersex people may have reproductive anatomy or genes that don't fit the typical definitions of male or female. For example, some people may have XX chromosomes but no uterus, or may have external anatomy that doesn't appear clearly male or female. Transitioning is changing yourself to reflect the way that you feel on the inside. This can include surgeries, hormones, changing your name, etc. Not every trans person transitions the same, and not all trans people transition. Some may socially transition and be happy with that. Social transitioning. Transitioning socially can include many things such as changing your name and pronouns, wearing different types of clothing, etc. Pre-op, post-op. Preoperative or post-operative refers to before and after a person has sexual reassignment surgery. SRS. Sexual reassignment surgery or gender-affirming surgery. SRS isn't necessarily one surgery. It's a category of surgeries that include top, bottom, and other surgeries that may alter a person's body or appearance. Hormone replacement therapy, or HRT. Trans people may take the hormones estrogen or testosterone to create more feminine or masculine characteristics like redistributing fat, making the voice lower or higher, gaining more muscle, stopping a period, etc. For trans and non-binary people in prison, housing is usually determined by biological sex or sex assigned at birth. Like, for example, a pre-op trans woman would get sent to a men's prison because she has not gone through SRS or sexual reassignment surgery. But if she gets SRS, she may be sent to a women's prison. However, it is not guaranteed because even transgender people who have changed their gender marker can be placed in the wrong prison, and that can put the person in an unsafe environment. This can be worse for non-binary people who don't fit in with men or women and are usually placed in the prison with their same sex assigned at birth. So an AFAB non-binary person would be placed in a women's prison, and an AMAB non-binary person will be put in a men's prison. Aside from Aside from being a transphobic and oppressive system, it endangers trans and non-binary people and it puts them in an environment where they could be sexually, physically, and emotionally abused. There are some states like Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and now California, which houses inmates according to gender identity instead of sex assigned at birth. California's governor just signed a bill to not only house inmates according to their gender identity, but to record each inmate's gender identity, titles, and pronouns so they can be acknowledged correctly. So there is being progress made in some states. However, it is still a very large problem in many more correctional facilities. Trans and non-binary people in prison are frequently denied healthcare like hormone replacement therapy, gender therapy, and SRS. This is very unhealthy and potentially dangerous for them because they can become very dysphoric and as a result become depressed, anxious, and even attempt suicide or self-harm. Here are a bunch of statistics from the Center for Suicide Prevention. It shows that 22 to 45% of trans people have attempted suicide in their life, and in 2014, 2/3 of trans youth have reported self-harm within that year. The suicide rates amongst trans and non-binary people have always been notably higher than cis people because of gender dysphoria and the situations that they may face because of their gender identity. Imagine seeing yourself every day and picking at the little things that remind you what society perceives you as or the gender that you are not. This is why things like hormones and SRS are very helpful as they affirm that person's gender identity and can alleviate this dysphoria. When it comes to gender dysphoria, it's not as harmful as serious for some, but for others, it could be life or death. For example, Adri Emo, a trans woman who sought gender confirmation surgery and was denied, and became so dysphoric that she attempted to castrate herself twice. In 2018, her case was brought to the federal district court, and they ruled that withholding the surgery was basically withholding medical care, and that it violates the 8th Amendment as it is cruel and unusual punishment. She was the second transgender inmate in U.S. history to get gender confirmation surgery while incarcerated, showing how common it is for trans and non-binary inmates to be denied health care. One of her attorneys, Lori Rifkin, puts it perfectly. Prison administrators can't treat medical conditions related to gender dysphoria or transgender people any differently than they treat any other medical conditions under the 8th Amendment. They don't get to pick and choose which medical conditions to treat. Oh, there we go. Since many trans and non-binary people are placed in incorrect housing, they are subject to all kinds of abuse from fellow inmates and staff. They are at a higher risk of physical, sexual, and verbal abuse. According to a 2015 survey by the National Center for Transgender Equality, transgender people are 9 times more likely than the general prison population to be sexually harassed or assaulted by other inmates. And in 2013, inmate Miguel Crespo attacked Carmen Guerrero, a trans woman, after sharing a cell for only 8 hours. During that time, Crespo bound, gagged, tortured, and killed Guerrero in their cell. A former prisoner, Rojas, who is gender nonconforming, gave a quote that sums up the abuse that trans and non-binary people face. It is like we are not human, period. They constantly misgender us, and that hurts, but that's the least of our problems. They always want to humiliate us, even in the way they handcuff us. If you're GNC, gender nonconforming, or trans, they twist your arms back, and it's really painful. They make you bend over as they walk you across the yard. You're the joke of the prison. Staff make fun of you. They'll talk about our bodies and ask us if we know what we are. They'll joke about periods. They'll dangle a tampon in front of you and taunt you. A male guard said he would show me what a real man was. And I was threatened with rape, and then I was laughed at when I was scared. They would strip me, and I'd be naked in a room full of male officers. They parade you around, and we would get disciplined way more than anyone else. We were abused in every way. In addition to physical, verbal, and sexual abuse that they face, Trans and non-binary people are mistreated because of their gender identity, like for example, being dead named, which is the use of a transgender or non-binary people's birth or former name without their consent. They are also prohibited from wearing clothing of the opposite sex or whatever doesn't fit the traditional female or male clothing for them. They can't wear makeup or other accessories that make them feel like themselves. This can add on to the immense dysphoria that trans and non-binary people may already face within the prison system. Here's a quote from the book Captive Genders, which shares a person's experiences and advocacy work in Ontario prisons. When people take away your opportunity to have self-determination, which happens in many ways in prison, but can be so detrimental when you're a trans woman and you're put in a men's prison and you're being denied your hormones and you're being denied called the name that you chose and you're being called he all the time. Black, trans, and non-binary people. Rojas touched on this subject in their interview with The Guardian, but Black and brown, trans, and non-binary people face racism on top of transphobia. They will face the discrimination from prison staff, but also from their fellow Black and brown inmates. This is illustrated in a quote from Captive Genders. But different groupings will not accept someone on the basis of some part of their identity. So for Black trans women, one of the Black groupings will say, "We don't want you," or we'll only have you if you sleep with all of us and give us all favors. So it means having to find a husband immediately, and if he's not a good one, you can be out of luck. And being out of luck means being raped on a regular basis, being harassed by guards on a regular basis. It's okay to be racist to trans women because they're traitors to the race. This is supported by the fact that outside of prison, trans women of color, mostly Black trans women, have been murdered at alarming rates for some time now. So far in 2020, at least 31 transgender or gender nonconforming people have been killed in violent attacks, the majority of whom were Black and Latinx transgender women. This discrimination is also prominent in the Black Lives Matter movement, a movement aimed to eradicate white supremacy and prevent state violence against Black people. A portion of BLM activists, mostly cishet Black men and women, see Black trans issues as separate and a part of the queer movement only. However, a lot of white queer people feel as if those issues are Black issues and are separate from the queer movement, despite the fact that the Stonewall riots, a hallmark of the queer movement, were started by a Black trans woman. You see the dilemma? Another quote from Captive Gender states, "At the nexus of race, class, gender, and sexuality, Black gender oppressed activists bring to the anti-prison movement a unique vision of social justice and based on lived experience of racialized policing, surveillance, and imprisonment. This shows that despite the racism and transphobia they face, Black, trans, and non-binary people still continue to fight the oppressive prison system for those who can't and won't."
Do not call it a comeback. Amari has returned and they will be presenting on prison slavery.
Hello, it's me again. Okay. Next slide, okay. During the Reconstruction period after the Civil War ended in 1865, a practice called convict leasing began. Prisons would lease prisoners to the highest bidding corporations, and prisoners would be forced to do their labor for free. Some of the sectors of labor that prisoners were forced into were mining, railroad construction, and farming. States that practiced convict leasing had convict death rates that were 10 times higher than non-convict leasing states. Of those leased prisoners, a majority of them being Black, 25% of them died before completing their sentences. Those who supported convict leasing cited the 13th Amendment to defend the practice. Though the convict leasing system itself no longer exists, prison slavery does. Slavery was never truly abolished in America. The 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Slavery is still legal as long as it is a punishment for a crime. While striking with prisoners during the prison strike of 2016, Alex Friedman, who had served 10 years in prison, previously said, "The 13th Amendment didn't truly abolish slavery. It permitted exceptions." On September 9th, 2016, the largest prison strike in U.S. history began with over 24,000 prisoners striking between 24 states. The start date, September 9th, was the 45th anniversary of the Attica prison riot in New York. It was a general strike for prisoners' rights, however, the focus was on prison slavery. As large as the strike was, it got little to no news coverage. 2 years later came the prison strike of 2018. Mainly as a response to a prison riot at Lee Correctional Institution from April of that year, which resulted in the deaths of 7 inmates, prisoners in over 17 states went on strike from August 21st to September 9th of 2018. The start date symbolized the 47th anniversary of the death of George Jackson, who was shot while attempting to escape prison, and the end date symbolized the Attica prison riot. Family members of inmates who participated in this strike reported that their loved ones were punished with things as extreme as solitary confinement. Unlike the previous strike in 2016, this strike was not a general one. The prisoners had 10 demands. I will be focusing on their second demand, which states that they want an immediate end to prison slavery and that all people imprisoned in any place of detention under U.S. jurisdiction must be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. Prisoners aren't able to choose not to work. The amount of money that prisoners make for their labor varies from state to state, some making $2.15 an hour and some making nothing at all. In Illinois, prisoners make anywhere from $15 to $75 per month. Most assignments are paid 75 cents to $2.15 per day, which is $15 to $45 monthly. And off-grounds work camps pay work crews $45 to $75 monthly. A workday is at least 4 hours, and there are 21 workdays per month. In Georgia, however, regular jobs, also known as non-industry jobs, go unpaid. Maine differs from both Illinois and Georgia because there are no DOC policies related to financial compensation for work assignments, and therefore the amount of wages that prisoners make or don't make varies from facility to facility. Why do we call it prison slavery and not prison labor? Because calling this prison labor is not an accurate description of what it is. A prisoner named Tony, who was striking in 2018, stated that taking part in strikes can also affect a prisoner's possibility of parole. They will lock you down and replace you with prisoners who are willing to work. If you're not working on one of these jobs, you lose all privileges. You have to be doing something or you face punishment.
All right. So now that the presentations are done, we do have some time for questions for each presenter. So I guess if that's the case, then we might as well go in order. Does anybody have any questions for Matthew and Kaleigh? You can use your little thing on the Zoom to raise your hand. And yeah.
Also, the chat is now live again, so if you don't want to go on speaker or on video, you can put your question in the chat.
All right, so we actually have a really prevalent question from Dennis Lee. And he wants to know what were the best sources of data. Kaleigh, can you tell them a little bit about the source page as well?
Yes, so the best source of data for the prison system is actually the sentencingproject.com, but we can also find all of our sources on the source document, which we will be emailing out to you guys. And also, if you join the Remind, that will also be on the Remind as well.
Yeah, and we'll make sure to re-put the Remind slide up so that everybody gets the info and is able to sign up for that.
Yes, and I see Mr. Azika has his hand up.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
How's it going? Really great job. Thank you guys for putting this all together. My one question, and I believe you mentioned this in your presentation, Kaleigh, but as my wife and I are listening, she's wondering, she's like, I know I'm a Spanish teacher. What can I do about these issues in the prison system? So I was wondering if you could just reiterate that, or maybe send that on the Remind.
Mm-hmm. So other solutions, that would just be knowing your rights and sharing those rights to other people, as well as forming alliances and forming groups if there's like a protest to go against the government or the prison system. That will also be a big help. Did that answer your question?
Thank you guys so much. Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. You're welcome.
It's hard to go against the system that locks people up if the system that locks people up will lock you up for going against it.
So it looks like we're getting a few other questions, but I think it would be up to y'all, which one you wanna answer for your third one.
I see a couple here. So what made you choose the topics you focused on? I think the injustices that we saw that were so prevalent here and stark. So we wanted to bring attention to those. And then how is it decided whether someone is sent to public versus private prison? This is completely decided by the judicial system. I think the states will try to negotiate with the private prison companies directly and figure out some type of balance of having some people in private and some people in public, but there's no specific standard. It's a case by case type of thing. So.
Mm-hmm. And also why I chose my specific topic. So that's my role, not my role, my career as a future career person for a job. I would do incarceration work like a lawyer or being a judge to get justice for these people and the wrongly accused. So this is up my alley.
And also not to cut the questions for Matthew and Kaleigh off, but we do want to kind of go through everybody and get everybody a chance to, answer some questions. And then if we have time, we can cycle back. So I guess, does anybody have any questions for Zoe and her presentation on immigration? Feel free to, again, raise your hand or just put it in the chat.
One way, I realize some people might not know, but one way to raise your hand, if you go to participants, it should be one of the, on the bars, there's a little yes, no, raise hand, lower hand, and that should be an option. Or just do the emoji with it has a hand raise or a thumb up, and we can scroll through and see who has that up.
And if you're on your phone, it should appear at the bottom as like 3 dots where it says more. And then, yeah.
Thank you, Betsy, for your source. We will look into that.
I have a question for Zoe.
Go ahead.
She mentioned the current president's policies dating back to 2017. So with the election of a new president, does she see a change coming forth in terms of immigration in the next administration?
Well, I definitely know that Trump's platform was very central around this, and I think that Biden has been a little less vocal about it. I can't predict the future because when I tried to predict the future in 2016, that didn't work. So I don't know, but I will say, like, going back to my slide on the timeline, there was the law passed. I need to find the specific name of that private companies were starting to have limits being put on them, and I can definitely look into more how that's going to change over time because of that economic incentive. There, if that continues to be limited, I think that we could see a change in that, and I know that Biden is potentially on the side of favoring that kind of limiting on economic spending.
For sure.
Thank you.
Speaking of limiting, Elena Doyle put a comment in the chat that I thought was really interesting. So Elena was asking about the impact COVID-19 has had on DHS facilities, and has it impacted how long people are incarcerated?
Yeah, I did find the research on Johannes Favi, but because it's so recent, it's been a little hard to find accounts because I feel like everything is changing so fast. I mean, before COVID, immigrant detention centers were very unsanitary and there were a lot of medical issues. So those were only exacerbated because of COVID. And obviously, it took them a long time to acknowledge the virus and they dismissed a lot of people's concerns about it. And again, just not keeping a social distance, being very disrespectful. I know people are being sentenced to shorter times because of COVID, but I don't have like a specific number as of now.
Mr. Ruzika has his hand up. He has a question for you.
Hi, Zoe. Once again, thanks for the presentation. So to kind of help you out there, Zoe, just today, President-elect Biden put on his website that he will stop deportations, at least while the COVID crisis is occurring. Now, if he follows through on it, that'd be different. But, you know, like you said, you can't really predict the future considering the Obama administration was pretty harsh on deportations, not as bad as the Trump presidency. My other question is, I'm probably gonna ask this to every group. Like, once again, like what can all of us here that are listening, what can we do? You know, what can we do to help out?
Yeah, definitely that got me thinking when you asked Kaleigh and Matthew. And you said your wife is a teacher, right? I think that even though it seems like you have to do this, you can't, it's an insurmountable task because the system is great. Yeah, donating to bail bonds helps a lot because, as all of us mentioned, we live in a capitalist society and any financial contribution does help. But I would also say one of my biggest things is education, and I think that's belittled a lot. People think, oh, because you're not right on the front lines protesting or getting legislation passed, they don't respect it as much maybe. But in my activist circles, a lot more people have been emphasizing making connections and education. And I think that's kind of the systematic thing that's going to change it, like everyone's thinking in the long term, as opposed to a band-aid approach. I mean, legislation obviously helps, and those kind of quick calls to attention do, but systematic education definitely is like my number one thing.
Thank you so much, Zoe. I appreciate it.
And before you go, Mr. Ruzicka, I would like to say thank you for taking the time out of your day to come here. I don't know if you remember, but I had you as a history teacher temporarily when the school fumbled my schedule upon my transferring process when I came over to Oak Park River Forest. So thank you for joining. This is the group that I would talk about when you would ask me the things I was interested in. So I appreciate you coming in today.
Oh, was that here? I remember you. You know, when I was blessed with your presence for those weeks, I appreciate it. And I am off the clock, so I'm just a normal citizen. So I'm just Peter, if you're asking. All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Peter.
Yeah, so I mean, Zoe has really good points, especially during a pandemic, you know, saying the things that we can do without, you know, gathering like we do for protests is a really good thing. And just getting legislation moving is important. Yeah, and so I guess let's see. So does anybody have any questions for Zoe and Amari on mental health? And we have a hand from LaShawn.
Yeah. I guess this to Amari. Does the stigma that's attached to mental health, especially like in the African American community, whereas we won't acknowledge that people have mental health problems within our family or within our community, does that play a role in, and I'm sure it does, but like how does that play a role in what ends up happening to people who are incarcerated because of basically a lot of times the mental health conditions that they may have?
Well, a large issue, especially in the Black community, as far as people who suffer from mental illnesses or struggle with mental health, is lack of education. And it's like one of my slides was titled "Don't Call 911," and a big thing that a lot of people don't know in general is to not call 911 on people who are in the middle of a mental health crisis. So, I mean, it really just starts with education. Like, people need to learn more about how to properly deal with these things and stop immediately resorting to calling the cops. And another thing would probably be like to start accepting and like acknowledging that people do have mental illnesses. Because like another thing is like the denial in general, where people won't acknowledge that they do exist.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So we did get a question in the chat from Elena. And Elena wants to know, what are the best options for people being released who have mental health issues? What should we push to our legislators?
Oh, Amari, you're muted. Wait.
I was gonna give that one to you.
Oh, well, I mean, I talked about the mental health course, but I wanted to do a lot more in-depth research. I think a good fix that's a less direct fix is pushing for more funding towards mental health care. And as we saw with the block grants, the shift of funding from block grants. Mental health facilities have to compete a lot with other public programs. So I think just getting more public support for those, because there is so much stigma and a lot of people don't want to, I won't be as harsh as saying don't want to help them, but they are a lot more reluctant to help them than someone that they feel like they can easily empathize with. A lot of it is financial, but I guess it is a possibility to push legislators for, there are some proposed bills circulating and I can find the specific documents. There was one center that's on the sources page that I lost the name of, but yeah.
And also, before I go to the next question, Kaleigh did put the remind information in the chat. You want to text at living HIS9 to 810-810. And also the question for you guys in the chat was, if the police aren't the best option, who should we call for someone in a mental health crisis?
As was mentioned, a large issue is the lack of alternatives, and that's something that more systems need to be put in place. But there are a handful of functional alternatives, but they are not running throughout the entire country. They're just in specific places in the states, and some of them are the crisis assistance. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Crisis assistance helping out on the streets, which is in Springfield, Oregon. There is a program in Sacramento, California, which is a group of mental health professionals who volunteer their time. And there is also the Oakland Power Projects, who trains health professionals to respond to things. But unfortunately, there are not any, I'm sorry, I got a phone call. There are unfortunately no systems running throughout the entire country that can be called like to immediately respond to these kinds of things.
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes, but does anybody have any questions for Sai or Zaire?
Also, am I picking the questions or do you pick them?
I mean, it just depends. Like if it's a bunch of questions, I'll ask you if there's one specifically you want to answer. If there aren't, then I'll just tell you what they are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you're obviously free to ask about any part of their presentation, whether you wanted to do the poverty to prison pipeline or the trans and non-binary piece as well.
Oh yeah.
I will also reshare the remind link on the screen in a minute to give more time. There is one question from Elena. Can you remind me which states have passed legislation about trans prisoners?
Hi, Mrs. H. Give me a second. Okay. It is Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and California just passed a bill for that.
Okay.
So yeah.
And I guess just because we really only have a couple more minutes, did anybody have a particularly burning question for Amari, or really anybody, but on Amari's presentation on prison slavery? And if not, was there any particular pressing question you wanted to ask any of our presenters?
Because if not, then we will conclude this meeting, and we appreciate you guys for coming. Following.
I don't have a question. I just want to say, mind blown. You guys rock. More effort and skills went into this than a lot of presentations I see at Northwestern. You're amazing, and I'm so happy that you're our future.
Thank you very much. That means the world.
That's so sweet.
Yeah. And it doesn't look like anybody has any particular questions. It's just a lot of praise, which obviously you all are deserving of. And so, yeah, I guess if that's the case, I'm going to tell you one more time to join the remind and text at living HIS 9 to 81010. Yeah, I guess that's it.
All right.
Bye, guys.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Everybody have a good night and a safe evening.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you all, y'all.